Hey guys, I don't normally talk before the narrations and stuff, but as you guys can tell, the video is gonna be in over an hour long. So yeah, I'd like to first of all thank Atlas, which is the writer of the story, which I love the story. It's really good. Um, it has a really good plot. I don't want to talk too much about it because you're about to listen to it. But yeah, and also another thing, I'd also like to thank the artist for letting me use his art for the thumbnail. I'm gonna put a little QR code on screen really quickly. That is his website if you guys want to go check it out. And last thing, uh, this video took me fucking a while to make. So if you guys can make sure to like the video and comment and maybe share it to somebody. That'd be super cool. If not, that's fine. Just listen to the video. That also helps. But yeah, love you guys. Thank you guys for listening. And it's a long one, so maybe get some popcorn or something. Are we close? The words kicked me out of my half-driving and half-head in a cloud state. I glanced over at my daughter. She had her arms folded over with her hands obscured in her pockets of her oversized Nirvana hoodie that I had bought her for her birthday. Her short, black, puffy hair covered most of what I could see, but in the midst of it, I saw white Bluetooth headphones and a golden piercing of a harp on her left ear, same as the one I had on my right. I sighed and went back to face the road, painted over with snow. We can't be far now, Blair. When we get close enough, I'll tell you so you can put on your hat and coat, so worry less about the road and more about getting some rest, okay? She sighed and put her hood up, resting her head on the car seat. Fine. She had the same temper as her mother used to have. It was odd not having her mother around to make jokes about my poor navigational skills before kissing me on the cheek and verbally helping me out. Well, when she wasn't spaced out staring at the tree lines. She always had a habit of staring to nothingness, but she wasn't here anymore. Her two golden ear piercings divided between her daughter and her husband, keeping a little part of her memory alive to carry through life with. Not soon after I spoke to Blair, I felt a head hit my shoulder and glanced to my right to see my daughter, fully asleep, leaning her head onto me. She had barely slept on the drive at this point, so I was glad to see it. Slowly pushing her head to the side and stopping the car to get a blanket and pillow from the booth to make her more comfortable. I opened the door of the car and was hit with an at first unbearable cold which settled after a few seconds but still remained freezing. Shit! I mumbled to myself, quickly closing the door and making my way around to the car booth. After grabbing the pillow and blanket, I shut it and made my way back around to Blair's side and opened the door. I moved her car seat a little further back so she had more room to lay down and relax her legs. Afterwards, I put a blanket over her body and raised her head gently before placing a pillow underneath. I kissed her forehead and closed the door, temporarily stopping to take a moment to enjoy the environment. Freezing as it was a beautiful sight. An inky, pitch-black ocean flowing with gray clouds above, leaking white snow overhead, painting every tree and blade of grass it touched a bright white hue which glistened with reflective light which sourced from the headlight of my car. Jen loved it up here. Every December, we passed through these woods to get to her parents' house with our daughter to spend the Christmas, but this would be the first year we would be visiting without her. While making my way back around, I wondered how our parents were taking the passing. But just before I opened the door to re-enter my vehicle, I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around, reacting to a sound. Hello? I shouted to the darkness behind, but got no response. I know I heard something close crunching the snow, but maybe it was just an animal or a twig falling. Nothing to get so worked up about. So I opened the door, got in, and shut it behind me before starting the car once more and putting my hands on the wheel. Before driving off further, I glanced at the outside mirror and was half expecting to see some glowy eyes staring back at me, but I was greeted with nothing. just darkness taunting me, with its blanket covering up whatever must have made that noise. I put my foot on the pedal and drove off, continuing the trip. After about 2 more hours of driving, the thought hit me that we should have seen a town by now, or even lights or some sign of life, but the road remained desolate. I reached for my phone on the dash and was relieved that I had signal this far into the woods. I dialed Blair's grandmother and was instantly greeted with the voice of a happy old woman. "Hey, Paul, you guys almost here?" "Yeah, I should be close by, but I think I might be lost. Is Don there?" Immediately after asking, I heard shouting, indicating the man I was questioning about was being called over to the phone. Then I heard Blair's grandfather pick up and greet me the exact same way his wife did. Millie and Jen were always two peas in a pod, usually taking Blair to go out and walk while me and Don shared our experiences as hunters. I fished, and he tracked and hunted stag around the area, so we both had a shared interest in nature and wildlife, which made it quite easy to be friends with one another. "Don, I think I'm lost. Could I bother you to drive up and see if you could find us?" He sighed and thought for a second before responding. "Any landmarks?" "I'll check," I said while putting the phone down and mentally preparing myself for the cold before opening the door and slowly taking a step onto the snow-covered road. I was shocked with how high the snow was. Before, only going up about an inch, and now maybe 3 or 4, entirely swallowing most of my boots. I didn't notice it before, but now that I was outside, I noticed a sign that looked like it once said the name of a road, but now was some unintelligible gray rectangle overgrown with vines and painted in a thick coat of rust. I went back inside the car and picked up the phone to enlighten Paul on my disappointingly small find. Just a rusty sign covered in vines. "Okay, what's the last turn you made?" "I took a left by the sign that leads to Link Letter, but apart from that, I kept going forward." "You were supposed to go in there and take a left, Paul. It leads to an entirely different road. I'll be there, but it might take a few hours, so get some rest. I'll call you if I can't find you." I wanted to give the option of driving back myself with the newfound knowledge of where I went wrong, but he hung up, and I knew how stubborn he was, so I wasn't bothering in making a pointless argument that would end the same way. I turned off the headlights of my car while moving the seat back and resting my head while facing Blair. While my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I started seeing more and more detail in the blackness behind the window. Tall grass, snow falling, thick trees, and behind one of them, fingers. Eyes? 2 shiny, gleamy eyes stared at the car window with fingers that seemed to be barely attached to the bone beneath it, staring, slightly perched behind the tree. I wanted to scream at it or to call someone, but my body wouldn't move. It was locked in motion, staring at the figure, when suddenly I heard a banging on the driver's side window, which obviously startled me badly, and I let out a scream, only to be comforted with a familiar voice muffled behind the window. "Easy, Tiger. It's just me." I calmed down and rolled the window, letting the cold breeze hit my face. It was Don, wearing a brown leather jacket and a black woolly beanie. He then gave a warm smile and started talking. "I know you guys usually pack light, so how about you put your luggage in my boot and we come back for your car tomorrow? You're probably tired and a wreck, ain't you?" I nodded and shook Blair awake, who was surprised to see Don, but happy to greet him. We then moved our bags into Don's green truck, but before getting in, after all was moved, I glanced over at the tree where I saw the figure, but I saw nothing there. I opened the car door and entered. Blair was in the back, laying down on our luggage like a mattress with a pillow under her head and a blanket covering her. Her own little makeshift bed, I thought to myself. I was seated beside Don in the front while he started the engine. I locked my car with the button on my keys and rested my head down again before a question hit me that I can't believe I hadn't thought about beforehand. "Hey, Don, how'd you get here so fast?" In an almost defensive way, he responded. "What do you mean? You called at 7, it's 10:30 now." "I only called you about 10 or 15 minutes ago." After I said that, he stared at me dumbfounded and asked in a worried tone, "Paul, you on something?" I nodded no and scoffed while thinking to myself that maybe I fell asleep and just didn't realize it. It would explain what I saw outside of Blair's window, just a short dream. Never mind. I probably fell asleep. He sighed and turned the car, driving off while I reached for one of the bags under Blair and pulled out a pair of headphones. I put them on before plugging them into my phone and turning on November Rain by Guns N' Roses. I then closed my eyes and drifted away. I woke up, panting and sweating head to toe in an unfamiliar forest clearing. Snow on the ground, a blood-red sky. I didn't know where I was, but all of the trees were 10 times taller and thicker than the forest anywhere near where we were. Blair, where are you? I screamed, panicking, terrified for my daughter's safety, but no response came to accompany my plead. After screaming, I looked around me and noticed the same figure that was staring at me and Blair through the passenger window, but much further away, around 40 feet. Then, I suddenly heard a sound behind me and turned, seeing another one. Exact same appearance, but one tree closer. Same fingers and same eyes. Without the window separating us, I could notice more details about the figure. I couldn't see color and the pupils just a void where they should be, making it feel like I was staring into darkness itself. It was also apparent that they were extremely bloodshot. Underneath the staring eyes were purple bags, making it seem like they hadn't been shut in days, perhaps much, much longer. The face of the figure looked like it was a rotting corpse. Rough, gray, decaying skin with cracks, cysts, and blisters covering each surface. Small patches of oily black hair dangling off the top of the head. Yellow, long, and sharp nails accompanied the seemingly rotting fingers. Suddenly, more noises. More figures. More, and more, and more, getting closer each time. Then I turned around and saw Blair standing in front of me with her eye sockets empty, black fluid leaking out of her sockets and her mouth dangling in an unnatural way, like an invisible creature was pulling her mouth in different directions to mock the victim. I couldn't muster anything, but I quietly sobbed at the sight of the most important person in the world to me standing before me mutilated. The embodiment of failing the final promise I made to my deceased wife, protecting our daughter. Suddenly, she mumbled something, but I couldn't hear it. Then, I heard shouting and woke up for real this time, shaking. "Paul!" I screamed and looked over at Don. It was just a dream, thankfully. I was palpitating and shaking, still tense from the image of Blair. Then I looked back at Don, still partially panicked. "Where's Blair?" He put his hand on my shoulder in an attempt to calm me down. He then arched his head towards the house in front of the car. "She's already inside. Are you okay, Paul?" I nodded and reached to grab my bag, but stopped realizing everything was already brought in. I then opened the door and went inside. Just a bad dream. I was still half asleep, so Don put his hand over my shoulder and walked me up to the door. The snow wasn't raining down anymore, and what was on the ground hadn't gotten any higher, so I assumed it must have settled not long after we took off from my car. I was just realizing how dumb of an idea it was to leave my car behind, but I trusted that Don would take me first thing in the morning. Each step we took made a loud crunch as we both crushed the snow under us. I looked up and faced the house. It looked the same as it had every year prior we had come for Christmas. The brick walls decorated with red and green lights dangling off with nails that me and Don had hammered into the wall a few years prior. A few small trees in front of the yard decorated with sparkling ornaments and battery-powered lights. As we walked up to the door, I saw the only new addition that year. A ring of holly covered with red fake roses surrounding a picture of me, Jen, Blair, Don, and Millie smiling. I can't remember when we took that picture, but we all looked so happy there. Blair looked much younger in the picture, maybe 7 or 8 years old, and looking at it gave me a sinking but warm feeling in my chest. I can't believe she's already 16. I mumbled to myself, Don wheezing a little and patting my back before opening the entrance to his home and pushing me in. I was expecting to see Blair on her phone or tucked away on the couch with her headphones on, but I was pleasantly surprised to see her in the kitchen talking to Millie and laughing. Don patted me on the back to get my attention and pointed at my bags, which were thrown on the side of the hallway. Don then went to go join the girls while I took my bags and carried them over to the spare bedroom. I checked the bags at the first chair I saw and jumped onto the bed with the full intentions of sleeping. I checked my phone and I saw it was almost 2 in the morning. I forced myself up, went over to the kitchen and told Blair to get some sleep soon and kissed her on the forehead before heading back to the spare room. I bid everyone a good night before shutting the door and collapsed onto the bed, closed my eyes, too tired to bother putting on the covers or even taking my clothes off. I woke up in the clearing again. I was back in the dream, but this time it felt a lot more lucid and I could tell more details. Alongside that, I was also aware it was a dream and not reality. I was in the center of a clearing surrounded by tall trees, reaching and clawing into the sky. Despite the blood-red void that was the sky, I could clearly see everything around me in its own shade of color that was not a red hue. The trees were all shades of gray. This time, I focused and saw a path of gravel that seemed untouched by snow in contrast to the rest of the floor, leading deep into the forest, so with nothing to do, I decided to follow it. Just a few steps onto the gravel, and I heard a sound coming from my left, so I looked over, already knowing what to expect, but being taken by surprise. It was standing fully straight. I looked up at the 10 or 11 foot tall behemoth of rotting flesh and decaying skin. It had a long, gray, wet gown on, and the more I focused, the more I could see movement under its clothes. Then, I saw one of the small moving things come out of one of the sleeves and crawl down the slender arm that seemed to have no flesh at all, just bone and skin. I saw a centipede crawl down the arm and stopping at the wrist and prying itself into the skin, disappearing into the rotting flesh with a moist squelching sound to accompany it. I was disgusted by the sound and terrified by the sight ahead of me, but I stood my ground and mumbled out a sentence. "What did you want from me?" After I said that, it seemed like it tried to speak but failed, moving its mouth but making a raspy crackling noise instead of a voice. Black liquid leaked out of its mouth. Then I woke up, far more peacefully than how I awoke in the car from the similar previous dream. I glanced over at my phone and powered it on, reading the time, 13:47. I hopped up off the bed, and still fully dressed from not changing the previous night. I straightened the bed and changed my clothes from a polo shirt and work trousers to a pink t-shirt with a cat on it, and black sweatpants which I wrapped a black turtleneck around just in case it got colder later on in the day. I exited the room and saw Dawn sitting down drinking a coffee and Millie cooking something in a pot in the kitchen. Their entire house had that feeling of a textbook cozy cabin. Every single thing had a homemade feel to it, each surface being the same soft brown wood that somehow had the appearance of being candle-lit despite the current light source being the exterior white sky. I walked over to the table and sat down beside Dawn. "What time did you guys fall asleep?" He then looked over at me with bloodshot eyes, which brought the image of the figure into my head. He then smiled before responding. "Oh, we put it to bed more or less right after you went, but I stayed up setting up your surprise." I was obviously curious, considering what he had just told me, but before I could question him, Blair opened up the door while yawning. She sat down and said good morning while I looked over at her and laughed about it already being evening. Millie put 4 bowls on the table and poured porridge into them, and we all dug in. After we finished, Don told me and Blair to wait there as he ran off into his garage. Millie rolled her eyes and went into the sitting room. Seemed like she didn't agree with whatever Don had planned. Don then came back and threw a rusty 12-gauge shotgun, a silver revolver, and a hunting rifle onto the table alongside an old dusty book. "We're going monster hunting." "What?" I shouted back, clearly confused and a little agitated that he fully planned on handing my daughter a gun without my permission. But he said he'd spent the night preparing something, so I was under the impression that he might have set up some kind of elaborate fake monster hunt. Or maybe we were pursuing a particularly big animal. I didn't really know what to do or say, so after Don stared me in the eyes, indicating to go silent with his fingers to his mouth, I obliged. But I didn't want to just blindly follow Don's surprise hunt, so I asked while Don was reaching for the revolver, supposedly to show Blair. "Don, what monster are we hunting?" He changed the trajectory of his hand and grabbed the old book and waved it around his face, which blew dust all over the table. It had a symbol of a rose and a glass on the cover. "That's for me to know and you to find out." I hated that response, but I couldn't protest. Don wanted to spend time with his granddaughter, and even if it was an odd scenario, I was just thankful I was roped into it to make sure that Blair doesn't go anywhere dangerous. I remember seeing the guns before, but all I ever did was smoke in the garage where the weapons were with Don before walking around the forest admiring nature together. I decided to look over at Blair, who I only then realized was staring at me. She leaned into my left ear and whispered, "Are we gonna go?" I whispered back, asking if she wanted to. She nodded back to indicate a yes. I sighed and glanced at the table and grabbed a shotgun. It was the only weapon here I fired before from a drunken incident with me and Don a few years back. In about half an hour, Don, Blair, and I were leaving through the front door, each armed to battle the cold and whatever else may dwell ahead. Blair had a red puffy jacket with a black beanie, scarf, and gloves, all topped off with camo trousers she borrowed from me, which I was surprised fit her with the help of some rolling up, socks, and rubber bands. Don had on a whole set of dark brown leather bottoms, a jacket, gloves with a black silky scarf, and a brown taper hat, or winter hat, whatever you want to call it. I had on more or less the same apparel, just different sizes, cheaper trousers, and all black, except for my hat, which was a blue woolly beanie with a pink heart which Jen gave to me a few years back. I didn't leave much places without it. Don had thick boots. He lended a pair of his to me, and Blair lended a pair of hers to her grandmother. Me and Don had large, heavy-duty bags as well. Mine contained food, and his containing ammunition and other supplies he didn't go into detail about. Our journey began with us taking a path behind Don's home, which we traveled almost every year. Moving around the exterior of his house was a challenge. The boots may have kept us warm, but the snow was so thick each step took twice as much effort as the previous night. "Blair, keep the gun pointing at the floor and keep your finger off the trigger." "Sorry, Dad." She went along with my request, and Don gave me an approving nod before continuing ahead. We walked along the snow-ridden path for 20 or so minutes. Nothing stood out to me as strange. The tall, flourishing trees that once shielded the path from rain now dead, catching snow on their branches. Fields of white reflecting the white sky and almost glowing, reaching far ahead in every direction, concealing whatever lay past the woods which hid away Don and Millie's home. The path wasn't really visible, only apparent by occasional wooden rods that were there long before me and Jen's time together, now left to be overtaken by moss and snow on the tip. Every year we came here, we would continue to the end of the path, then turn right to head towards the lake, which was shallow and usually frozen around this time of year, so even if someone fell through the ice, rescue wouldn't be a difficult task, if necessary at all. So everybody had this sense of comfort and was more than fine goofing around on the lake. The path stopped, only being indicated it ended by a rusty bucket Don had left a few years ago when he had almost wandered off the path. While walking, I thought a lot about the lake. I was assuming we were going there, so previous memories of family expeditions drew themselves into my head. Me falling through the ice and jumping out of freezing cold water and having to take off my trousers while running home pantless. Everyone laughed except for Jen, who couldn't stop offering her coat as a wraparound skirt while we ran back to the cabin. After a little more walking, we arrived at the bucket, but instead of turning right and walking towards the lake, we went straight ahead. "Don, the lake's that way." "We're going this way." He cut me off. I didn't say anything else. I followed along confused, knowing that wherever Don was leading us was uncharted territory, at least by me. I couldn't shake off this feeling of building anxiety, so I switched which hand I held the shotgun in and asked Blair to hold my hand, which she was more than happy of doing. I'm glad we were like this, and not torn apart. As much as we missed her mother, we both had each other left to comfort and get through with. The worst times had passed, and we were already healing, or at least trying our damn best. I started noticing that the further we went, the taller and thicker the trees got. The fog caused by the heavy snow seemed to get slightly thicker each step deeper we took. After an hour of the same sight, I started getting a little annoyed. "Don, how much longer?" He sighed and turned to me with a disappointed expression and spoke with an agitated tone. "It'll take a while, but we'll get there. It'll be worth it, I promise. Get where? I responded with a mix of anger and general fear of getting lost. Whatever I felt, I sure as hell wasn't prepared for Don's outburst. Shut the fuck up and follow me, Paul! I shut my mouth and felt Blair squeezing my hand, a little scared herself. I don't think she ever heard Don scream. Neither had I, to be fair. We walked the rest of the journey in silence. He never seemed that angry before, but I chalked it up to him hiding his feelings about his daughter's passing and it building up and releasing in a short outburst. Seeing the idiot his daughter married and his granddaughter probably brought up his feelings he tried clogging out. It was just so odd to see that side of him, even for a few seconds. We kept walking for 2 more hours before we arrived at our destination. Don stopped dead in his tracks, staring ahead. I went to his side, and my jaw dropped, staring at what I saw. A giant crater, maybe a kilometer wide and 20 or 30 or so meters deep. In the bottom of it, there seemed to be a small hole. Don turned to safety off on his rifle and began climbing down without saying a word. He turned to face us after a few seconds, realizing we weren't following. You coming? I stared at him, wishing I never went in the first place. It was a spectacle to see, and I never had any idea this was here, but I didn't want to see where the hole led to. That previous feeling of anxiety felt like it was overwhelming me now. Where are we, Don? What is this? It's a surprise. Now come on before it gets dark. I probably would have argued or just went back if it was just me, but as soon as Don mentioned the word surprise, Blair let go of my hand and started going into the crater behind Don. I knew I had to follow, so I didn't bother waiting and sighed, beginning my way down. It was really steep, but after only a few handful of minutes, we were at the bottom, staring at the small hole. About 2 of us could fit in through the opening, so it wasn't going to be a problem for us to get in. Don sat down, rummaging through his bag, so I did the same with mine and took in the surroundings. For whatever reason, snow wasn't anywhere on the sinkhole, a little speck of dark color in a sea of white. Roots and plants grew alongside the outskirts, but none further down into it, like nature itself was scared of whatever laid inside the hole we were sitting over. The trees around us looked giant compared to the previous trees of the pathway. They felt weirdly familiar, but I couldn't put a finger on where I had recognized them from. The sky now was more dark gray than the white it was when we left, but it still illuminated everything clearly. Darkness didn't concern me though, since Don had packed flashlights alongside his ammunition and supplies. Don pulled a thin but long rope out of his bag, which I didn't even know he had, and then the dots slowly started connecting together. Don, we're not fucking going in there. Blair gave me a surprised look, since I don't swear often, especially not around her, but she sided with me. Don looked angry, but didn't sound it. He sounded desperate. Come on, Paul. We made it all the way. Absolutely not! I shouted. He sighed and put the rope down on the ground and threw 2 flashlights at the floor besides me and Blair. I had absolutely no intention of going into that hole, and after grabbing a flashlight with my free hand, I was gonna begin a product cure, which would end off with me walking off. I was about to start shouting at Don to lead us back, but I only got one word out before getting cut off by a gentle but familiar voice. Sweetheart, is that you? The wind went silent. Any animal that made background noise stopped chittering too. An uncomfortable silence between us. I was too stunned to say or do anything after, so I collapsed on my knees. I did nothing but clench the flashlight as hard as I could in my hand. Don seemed sad. Not shocked, but sad. Blair ran to the side of the hole, peeping her head into it. Between sobbing, she screamed, Mom? Mom, is that you? Please, answer me, Mom! I stood up and walked over to Don and hit him in the nose with my knuckles, still gripping the flashlight as hard as I could. When Blair realized what I had done, she ran over to her grandfather, trying to wipe his bleeding nose with the sleeve of her coat. I identified her body, Don, not you! I was there, I heard her last fucking words. I started sobbing, and I felt a void in my chest build bigger and bigger, but I continued on. I tried to get her out of that fucking car. I pried and I pried and I pried until I burnt every muscle on my hand. I know she's gone, so I'm gonna ask you one more time. I dropped the flashlight and pointed the gun barrel straight at him, shaking, terrified, but desperate for an answer. What the fuck is that? He didn't look scared of me. He looked defeated, miserable, eyes shrink wrapped in tears, but he didn't respond. I pointed the gun away and put my focus into the hole. I collapsed onto my knees and crawled over to it, leaning more than I probably should have. I didn't say anything, but I thought maybe I'd see whatever was down there. I didn't believe in the paranormal, but I haven't heard her voice in so long. It riled a fire in me that I thought had permanently sizzled out. I got out, grabbed the flashlight, and returned to the leaning, putting almost my entire body weight into the hole. I shined the light into it, and all I saw was a rocky floor 15 or so feet down with a passage too awkward of an angle to see into. I stopped leaning and kneeled on the floor beside the hole and put my hands on my face, realizing how badly I was sobbing. I hadn't even realized I stared down at the hole. I knew she was gone. I knew she was dead. I knew that was it, but I called out anyways. Yeah, sweetie, it's me. I was gonna say more, but before I could, I felt the barrel of a rifle on my back and a sudden pressure. Maybe if I wasn't crying so bad, or had been more cautious, I might have been able to catch myself on the ground around the hole, but I didn't. I fell right into it, looking up at Dawn, who had that same miserable expression. I felt like I was falling in slow motion. It felt like the moment of falling would last forever, until it didn't. The impact of the fall sent a shockwave of pain down my entire body. I kept my eyes shut and clenched my teeth together as hard as I could, trying to hold in my screams of agony. I quickly opened my eyes and stood up, only to find myself back in the clearing in my dreams. I realized an eerie similarity with the clearing in the area of the sinkhole. Instead of finding a monster or Blair contorted, I saw ahead of me a picnic table with a basket beside it. Just how me and Jen's first date was. I thought to myself, despite the far more pressing matters at hand, like my daughter's safety or even my own body after the fall, they seemed like a distant concern when I was there, and I couldn't stop myself from going over to the blanket and sitting on it like I had so many years prior. I didn't see her, but I already knew who was there when I felt a cold hand grab mine. Hey, sweetheart, how you been? I sighed, clenching all my body, and acknowledged how real everything seemed. The more I thought about the blanket and basket, the more the environment shifted from the grim clearing to the sunset hill near our college overlooking the town surrounded by thick evergreens. Fine. I miss you. She giggled to herself, and I noticed in between the giggle a kind of error. It sounded like a distortion, but it was so quick and short it could have been missed entirely if anybody else heard it. But it was me, and I knew how Jen laughed. Blair holding up? I guess. She clenched my hand harder, but I still resisted the urge to glance at whatever was there. She deserved the response from me, but it wasn't truly her. I just knew deep down. I jerked my hand off her grasp and curled up into a ball. Jen? Yes, sweetie? I noticed the distortion again, more noticeable and more profound now again in her voice in between words. Whatever the thing was, it wasn't having an easy time replicating Jen's soft voice. I wanted to shout something, punch the thing, scream at it. How dare it take my beautiful wife's voice, but I didn't have the strength to. I put my head into my knees, and I cried, lost in oblivion and weakness, incapable of fighting physically or emotionally. I felt a hug, arms holding me tightly, bony and skinny limbs, Skinny, disgusting, rough, and hard. Greasy hair dangled down onto my arms. I already knew what was holding me, but I didn't want to face reality. I love you. The thing tried to mumble out, but seemed to barely be able to hold on to her voice, leaking a black substance onto me. I love you too, Jen. I clenched my fist and sighed, preparing myself mentally. But you're not her. I elbowed the thing with full intentions of climbing onto it and beating the ever-living shit out of it, but as soon as I turned my head to face it, I was in the hole again. I looked up and saw the moon shining overhead. Multiple hours have passed since the fall. As much as I wanted to shout for Blair, I knew I wouldn't have the strength to, and it wouldn't matter. But I needed to get out of here as soon as possible. I desperately searched around me on the floor and was thankful to find the shotgun, which had 6 bullets chambered, and the flashlight, which was cracked but still functioning. I turned it on and aimed the light into the passage within the hole. It seemed to lead into a cavern after a short crawl space. I felt agony all over my lower section of my body, but I was relieved nothing was broken, or at least nothing was visibly broken, just badly bruised. With the flashlight and the shotgun in hand, I crawled my way through the passage. I hadn't been in a proper cave before in my life, but squirming and pushing with my feet came naturally for whatever reason. After squeezing through, I faced the passage I had just entered, examining the crawl space. There were huge, bear-like claw marks, more than I could count, going across all of the hole, as if someone couldn't fit in but desperately tried to. I finally glanced into the cavern itself and saw something nothing could have prepared me for. A moss-ridden, old run-down, wet cabin. Broken windows boarded up with wood, shattered glass on the floor, even vines coming from the sides taking the outside walls for its own. I noticed that it looked like a similar version of Don's, with the main difference being a patio, which Don's didn't have, and much smaller windows. An old cabin swallowed by the ground and trapped under the earth. I got up onto my feet, using the shotgun as a crutch, and made my way to the entrance of the cabin. Its door was entirely ripped off from the frame and laid on the interior floor of the cabin, covered in familiar claw marks. The wooden floor on the inside felt extremely soft and weak. Each step onto the flooring creaked loudly, as if suffering to hold itself together with my weight. It took some deep breaths and mentally psyching myself up, but I mustered the strength to use my voice. Hello? Anybody there? A harsh cough came over me right afterwards. I waited for a moment, expecting silence, but hoping for otherwise. To my surprise, I got a response. Not a verbal one, but I heard breathing coming from a room straight forward. The more I looked, the more I realized how the shape of the house seemed to be a near copy of Don's and Millie's. Just instead of the warm, welcoming environment, it felt like the house itself had given up on existing and just let nature reclaim it. I walked into where the kitchen would be in Don's home and jumped back into the hallway instantly, collapsing onto the floor and holding in a scream. I took rapid, panic breaths, hoping what I had seen was a figment of my imagination. After a few seconds, I built up the courage to peek around the corridor, staring into the room, and I saw exactly what I hope I hadn't. The same tall, slender creature I had seen in my dreams, on the floor. Instead of standing behind a tree, it was sitting on the ground, collapsed with its head leaning on the counter. Its hands on its sides, cuts and scars all over its arms, and neck leaking a black fluid into the floorboards. It was breathing slowly and heavily like it was struggling to take in each breath. It looked weak, bleeding, vulnerable. What are you? It tried to make a response, instead fluctuating between high and then low pitches, humming leading into a blurting out, a gargling in black fluid erupting all over itself. I should have been scared. I should have felt anger for this thing, after pretending to be Jen. But I didn't. I felt pitiful towards it, so I lowered my gun. Do you understand me? The thing seemed to struggle doing this, but it moved its neck up and down slightly to nod a yes, each slight movement cracking bone and squishing flesh loudly. Can you talk? It lifted its hand up and moved its index finger in a motion to indicate me to come to it. Yeah, not happening, pal. I sat down on the floor, cross-legged, just opposite to it. After I rejected its request, it put its hand down and wheezed once again, leaking the same black fluid. What about in my dreams? They repeated the same motion with their finger, asking me to come. This time, I did. I crawled over to it, and I took a seat on its right side and sighed. After I sat down, I acknowledged how odd it was that I didn't feel scared at all. This being was grotesque and had some sort of capabilities to copy people and enter their dreams. I should have been terrified. My thoughts were interrupted by a rotting finger approaching my head. I almost slapped it away, but I realized it wasn't going for my eyes. It was just too high. I felt its sharp nails hit my forehead and slowly moved down, stopping at my left eyelid, carefully closing it. I finally understood the intention and closed my eyes, and instantly felt a change of environment. When I opened my eyes, I was in the same cabin, but it wasn't torn down. It was just like Don's. Same material, same warmth. No furniture or food though, just an empty cabin. Instead of being lit by the sky outside or electric lamps, it was candlelit with a few extra candles on the counter of the table. I glanced over at the window and saw we were still in the cave. Here we are. I heard Jen's voice coming from my left and turned to see her where the thing had been, dressed in a white sundress covered in red roses. What she wore on our honeymoon. Is that really necessary? The stronger the emotional tether, the easier I can keep the appearance. Right. I stopped for a minute, lost in memory at the sight of her. She looked just as beautiful as I remembered. I stopped gawking and stood up on my feet, leaning my hands on my stomach on the countertop. What can I call you? Sam. I'd like to be called Sam. I was surprised by this. It said it had a name. Was it a person before? I wanted to ask, but Sam cut me off before I continued. I don't have long. If you want to get out, you're gonna need me, and I need you. I nodded my head to agree with Sam. They put Jen's hands on mine. I was surprised by it, but I couldn't help myself from almost crying at Jen's warmth and touch on me again. She mumbled under her breath. There's vials in my chest. 3 of them. One of them isn't working anymore, and I have a small chunk of my strength back, but not nearly as much as I once had. Rip them out and shatter them. I pulled my hands back, acknowledging it wasn't Jen, but Sam faking her appearance that was holding me. Then I nodded again to say I understood. The next time I blinked, I was back in the rundown cabin with the thing back on the floor and Jen's image gone. I grabbed the flashlight which had fallen beside me and checked the drawers, and I couldn't find anything sharp, so I deducted I needed to do the procedure barehanded. I didn't want to see the lower part of the decaying corpse, so I ripped a hole in the abdominal area of the dress. It didn't look as scarred or decayed as the rest of the body, but it looked gray, and the body itself looked extremely malnourished. I could easily see its ribs, and just between them, I saw 3 cylinders sticking out. I grabbed the very left one and tried pulling it out by the skin, but it wouldn't tear by itself. I should have tried ripping it out some other way, or looking for a knife, but I chose the quick solution of using my teeth to rip it from the skin. The best way I can describe the taste is what you'd imagine the word roadkill would taste like. Texture-wise, it was like rubber that leaked blood that somehow tasted like it was gone off. Anyways, I ripped a hole and expanded it with my fingers and pushed my hand in. It was like cold and wet. Each little push deeper into the corpse made a disgusting sound. After stopping myself from vomiting, I pulled out the first vial. It was a small tube about as big as my thumb with a cork cap. It had blood in it. I put it on the floor behind me and reached in for the next one and put it beside the first. When I pulled out the last one, I looked at it for a lot longer than the previous 2. Instead of a crimson hue for the blood, it was lighter, weaker. It looked more like a mix of mostly water and a small droplet of blood. I got up and took a deep breath in and stomped on the vials as hard as I possibly could, crushing each of them and bringing back pain from the fall into the hole all across my leg. I winced and looked up at Sam and jumped back a bit at them standing on their feet, having to arch their back and neck to fit into the cabin, and dragging their arms along across the floor. I was about to say something, but I was stopped by Sam dropping down onto all fours and moving through the cabin at a rapid pace, charging to leave her moss-ridden prison. Oh, Sam! Wait! I grabbed my shotgun from the floor and chased after. By the time Sam came back into my view, it was their legs from the other side of the cave's crawlspace. I slid my shotgun as far as I could and crawled as fast as humanly possible to the other side. When I got back to the bottom of the hole itself, I was worried Sam had left me, but looking up, I saw a familiar extended decayed and absurdly long arm reaching down. I put my flashlight between my teeth, the shotgun in my left hand, and grabbing onto Sam, letting them pull me out of the cave. As soon as I got out, a burning cold hit me. That, and the acknowledgement of how strongly it was snowing. I couldn't see anything more than 10 feet away. The mental daze of the fall finally ended and got replaced with Don's backstabbing, but more importantly, that he had planned to do it to Blair. I looked around for Sam, who I saw was marching up the crater to get to the top, so I followed as close as I can behind. Even running, it was a struggle to catch up to them, but I eventually did. Sam kept walking into the woods, and I kept following. They seemed to be specifically trying to stay at a speed I could keep up with for jogging. I started running faster, and Sam picked up the pace ahead of me, leading me deeper into the woods with seemingly no indicator of a path or trail. When Sam finally stopped, I collapsed onto the floor. It wasn't being out of breath or the cold that knocked me down, but my legs were in pieces. My arm hurt from carrying a gun, and my back felt like I recently got ran over by a semi-truck. All the aching from my body was catching up to me, but I couldn't rest until I knew Blair was safe. I got back onto my feet and looked ahead to see a lake. Our lake. The shallow lake near Don's cabin that we usually would have gone to instead of that fucking crater. It was odd that we got there so quickly considering how far the crater should have been, but it wasn't the primary thing in mind. Ahead of the ice, I saw an orange light emanating from the middle of the lake. A fire. Dawn. I stood there, staring at the soft orange glow amongst the snow for a moment. I fell into my own thoughts. How could Dawn have done this? We were supposed to be a family. Blair was supposed to be family. He hurt us in a moment when we were healing, and I knew I was gonna make him pay. Through blood and whatever means necessary. The adrenaline must have been keeping the frost at bay, because despite the clearly violent snowstorm that had appeared when we were nearing the lake, I felt fine. Sam kicked me out of my own thoughts by getting down onto all fours and slowly making steps towards Dawn. Each movement of her feet and hands left a deep cut in the snow-covered ice. I joined her march towards Dawn. Each step from me made a soft crunch in the snow, which was widely different to Sam's, who sounded like she was trying to gouge a hole into the ice, pushing hard and scraping her nails into it. I would have kept going slowly if I hadn't heard a cry from Blair. "Dad, please!" She sounded like she had been crying for hours and was wailing without the true idea if I would have heard her or not. Just a desperate SOS cry more than anything. The idea of that roused a fire in me, and despite all injuries, despite the weird snowstorm, despite Sam, I ran ahead until I could finally make out the shape of a campfire. As soon as I did, I screamed. I screamed so loud, I felt like I could have thrown up blood. Every sheer ounce of aggression, every grief, the thought that he took away a place so special to us, so special to Jen. I screamed with the intention to kill, not to hurt, not beat. Kill. Don! You better fucking run, or you'll wish that thing caught you before me! As I finished the sentence, Don came into view. I was seeing too much red to think of the surroundings, so I jumped onto him, dropping the things I held without looking for Blair, and launched the both of us down into the snow, hitting his head hard against the ice. He had this expression of shock on his face, like he had seen a ghost standing in front of him, or like he was dreading the idea of something I did. In a pathetic and weak voice, he mumbled out, "No, you wouldn't understand. I would have helped you after. I knew you I cut him off with a punch in between his cheek and his nose, blood painting the snow beside his face, leaving him with a mark on his eye and a slight dent in his nose. Not enough, not nearly enough for what he ruined. What we needed. The comfort Blair could have had. Her mother's family, the family we loved. The one he was supposed to love. So I kept punching. Left cheek, right cheek, black eye and a crooked nose. Left cheek, right cheek, then straight down on him, entirely shattering his nose. It looked dislodged, cracked even. It still wasn't nearly enough. Left cheek, right cheek, jaw, nose, over and over and over and over, before stopping, out of breath. I stared at him for a full minute, admiring the battered and bruised appearance I had struck down onto him. As soon as I stopped, he tilted his head onto his right side and coughed up a pool of blood alongside two teeth, which both seemed to still have their roots intact. I was kicked out of my anger with the sounds of my daughter sobbing and calling for her dad softly. I looked up and saw Blair strung up onto a wooden cross made out of branches, all tied together and stuck with some kind of moss. In my blinded rage, I entirely forgot to prioritize her. I quickly got up off of Dawn and untied the ropes binding her to the cross. When I released her left arm, I noticed a bandage under her sleeve, but I didn't comment on it. She was sobbing profusely and hugged me before I could ask what Dawn had done. She was so cold, so fragile. I felt terrible about what she had to see. I pushed her out of the hug and got down on my knees, grabbing her shoulder, in turn realizing how bloody my hands were from Dawn's beating. Oh, what did he do to you, sweetheart? She tried to stop herself from crying, to say something. I wanted to tell her it was okay and to lead her out of the lake, but as soon as I was about to speak more, I was cut off by the sound of a gun being cocked. I turned to my left to see a broken mess making his final stand. A black eye, blood staining his jacket and trousers and the snow around him. A crooked nose with a broken jaw, and to top it off, two swollen cheeks. Despite the shaking from either the cold or the pain, he was aiming straight at me. I wasn't stupid enough to assume it was a bluff. I put my hands up and carefully looked around the ground for the shotgun, but couldn't see it. Don kept one hand holding the rifle at me and used the other hand that was supporting it to pop his jaw back into place. A clashing sound of bone to accompany it. He spit out blood before opening his mouth. That's better. I tried to put my hands down to grab Blair and put her behind me to keep her out of the direct line of fire, but Don held more firmly onto the rifle and shouted, You've done enough, you fucker! On the ground! I dropped down onto the ground. As soon as I did, he threw cuffs at me, which I assumed he must have kept in his pocket as a backup plan. I didn't want Blair to be any more scared than she already was, so I complied instead of arguing. When I cuffed myself, I looked up to see Sam, just barely in visible range, staring straight at Dawn with her mouth open and humanly wide, showing her teeth. I hadn't seen her teeth before, but the best way I can describe them are like sharp ends of a nail. Long, large gaps between them, and extremely sharp ends. In between the teeth, she was drooling a black fluid onto the snow, which was steaming, indicating the liquid was hot. Don noticed I was staring and turned to see her, but didn't seem surprised. The wonders of fire, huh? He tried to let out a laugh, but it came out as more of a strained cough. He sat down on the ground and rubbed his cheeks, appearing to be trying to come to terms with his own wounds. I wasn't trying to kill you. You know that, right, Paul? I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of a response, so I scoffed. Really? And when this is all over, you'll thank me in the end. Everything will be okay. You just need to trust me. I thought about those words carefully. I didn't know the full situation, but he pushed me. He hurt Blair. He did irreversible damage to us that we're not just gonna forget. And all for what? What is Sam? Still so many questions, and I didn't know if I should put my faith in someone I knew for years who hurt me, or something I just met that saved me. I decided to push with some questions so I could get some conclusion. Maybe something to redeem Don to myself. What is it, Don? He perched his head up, excited to have finally gotten a verbal response out of me. Fuck if I know, Paul. My daddy knew about it, and his dad, and his dad. We keep the thing here, or it kills us and everyone in these woods. So, you don't know? I know what it'll do to me and Melly if it was free, Paul. And it would do the same to Blair. I was about to ask what he meant by that, but he cut me off by pulling up his left sleeve and showing a long black scar across his wrist. Our blood's special. My daughter made yours special. It makes that thing weaker. If we put ours into it, it cripples it, but it costs us. Permanent visions, permanent nightmares. It makes hallucinations to drive us crazy enough to kill ourselves. The blood only works if the beholder's alive. I stared at Blair's bandaged arm and I imagined the deep cuts beneath it. I wanted more answers. Why was the scar black? Why was she on a cross? Why can't Sam come close to the fire? Why their blood? But I couldn't wait any longer. Don was willing to carve into my daughter's wrist to lock up something that he had no idea if it really did harm. Just reliant on stories that were passed down. Maybe Don had his own reasons, but it didn't change my conclusion. He had time to explain, but I wasn't satisfied. In one motion, I jumped up from the ground and kicked as much snow as I could towards Don's direction and charged at him with my hands cuffed directly in front of me. He fired a shot but missed, hitting the ice right beside us, and I jumped onto him, pushing him on top of the campfire. He seemed to be barely affected by the fire itself from the jacket, but the fire entirely died out from the impact. He threw me off of him and onto the snow, laughing to himself while stretching his back. I thought you were smarter than that, Paul. He was cut off by heavy breathing and buckets worth of black, steaming drool leaking onto his shoulder. He stared at me, entirely mute, refusing to move a muscle while I stood up and walked over to him. He didn't resist me reaching for the keys of my cuffs out of his jacket. Once the cuffs dropped into the snow, I faced Don straight in his bruised eyes and saw him weeping, a smell of shit coming off of him. Paul, I've wrapped Blair up, and I gave you the keys. I put a finger on his lips and shushed him. Leave your begging to her. I looked up at Sam one last time, who was staring at me. I noticed just how different her figure looked than how she appeared previously. Perhaps she had more strength now, and when she had the time while I was fighting Dawn, she changed her shape, but she wasn't cut apart and decaying now. She still had an impossibly human proportions and grotesque teeth, but her skin was smooth. Her dress was a white hue, and her hair was thick, long, and dark black. Her hair went down past her shoulders, almost touching Don's head. I gave her a final nod and mouthed the words, "Thank you," before turning around and grabbing Jen's hand and making a run for the tree line to get back to the path towards Don's house. I wanted to apologize to Blair for everything she went through, but I don't think any words I could have said would suffice in that moment. Just before reaching the path, we heard a final roar coming from the lake. "You fucking coward!" Followed by screams, flesh ripping, and eyes shattering. As soon as I got to the path, I collapsed onto one knee and looked Blair in her eyes. Her face was covered in snot and frozen tears. "Sweetheart, we're almost out of this nightmare, okay? I love you." I assumed Blair wanted to say she loved me too, but I couldn't hear her. I only saw her mouth moving. Even the wind went mute. After I noticed my hearing was gone, I acknowledged a lack of feeling in anything for that matter. Pain, cold, fear, anything. Then Blair got blurry in front of me. I knew the cabin was nearby, and I assumed Sam got who she wanted revenge for. With the last of my strength, I pointed towards the cabin, closed my eyes, and collapsed into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, I first acknowledged searing pain all across, well, everywhere, particularly strong in my legs. After groaning and forcing my eyes open, I saw Blair running over and trying to jump on me before being grabbed by Millie, who seemed worried about my condition and didn't want Blair to unintentionally hurt me. I groaned and sat up, realizing I was laying on a sofa in the living room of Don's cabin. It was weak, but I used my strength to ask the only thing on my mind. "What happened?" Blair was about to speak, but Millie grabbed her shoulder and nodded towards the kitchen. She took a seat on the couch to my left and sighed deeply before starting. When I came into Don's life, he always kept this barrier around his youth. A few years into our relationship, his father died. After a call with his mother, he began packing to leave for this damn cabin and said he'd never come back. Maybe it was the wrong choice, but I followed him. I noticed how Millie looked like she was about to cry. Her eyes shrank, wrapped in tears. Blair was brewing a pot of hot water, which I assumed would be for tea. I was gonna ask something after she stopped talking for a few seconds, but she put a finger up and kept going. When we got there, he would leave with his mother into the woods for hours at a time for a few weeks, till one day he came back bleeding at the wrists. He didn't go back for a while after that. I never asked about it because I wasn't sure if I really wanted the answer. She let out a sarcastic laugh after that, wiping her eyes and sighing as Blair brought me and her a cup of tea. I put the tea on the nearby coffee table and kissed Blair on the forehead before turning my face back to Millie once more. She took a sip of her hot drink and put it beside my cup. The next year, I stopped having my periods for 2 months. Turns out I was pregnant with Jen. Don was happy, but he seemed to have this worry in the back of his mind. Something only somebody who spends every day with him would notice. A month before her birth, his mother committed suicide in the lake. Don wasn't remotely sad about it, but that was the day he told me about that thing. He carved my wrists with an old stone that was apparently ancient and special in some odd way. He put a vial into my wrist and took small chunks of my flesh and blood into it. She opened her mouth to continue, but I cut her off. "And you stayed?" She looked at me in defeat, a hint of misery in her eyes. That sarcastic smile told me everything I needed to know. She was disappointed in herself. "Yeah, Paul, I stayed. After he hurt me, we both made a silent agreement to not talk about it, and I never asked why. When Blair was 14, Paul brought her into the woods, and she came back passed out in his arms with a blood-soaked bandage over her wrist. I shouted. I threatened to leave, but it was an empty threat. She then moved off of the couch and put her hands onto mine, lowering her voice to a soft, gentle tone, like she was trying to reassure a wild animal that she meant no harm. Blair told me everything. I didn't know what he was gonna do. He went out the night before to dig up the sharp stone. I thought he was gonna explain and ask you, since Jen passed, the blood vial from her was useless. Don needed a replacement. I didn't know what he was gonna do, Paul. I still had a bit of lingering suspicion, but deep down, I know she wasn't lying. I put my hand on hers and responded in a similar tone to her own. "It's okay, Mills. I trust you." She sighed and sat back down on the couch, taking a deep sip of her tea. I called for Blair and pulled her in for a long hug. After we finished, I asked her to help me onto the couch, and we sat down together. Me, Blair, and Millie, sitting peacefully with hot drinks after that nightmare. Then, a thought hit me. I glanced over to the Christmas tree, which had unopened presents under it. I grabbed Blair's hand and nudged my head over to the wrapped gifts. "Merry late Christmas, sweetheart,"